All right, welcome in everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to attend our judicial training on impaired driving and toxicology. My name is Katie McConville and I'm policy counsel at the Council for Court Excellence, and we are working to support our state judicial outreach liaison, Judge Craig Isco, in developing this training. We're very pleased today to have a stellar panel of toxicology experts here, and I'll pass the virtual mic over to Judge Isco to begin.
Well, thank you so much, Katie, and it's a real pleasure to be here with this distinguished panel to talk about such an important issue. As Katie just said, I am the State Judicial Outreach Liaison for the District of Columbia. Uh, During my 22 years as a judge, I started in 2003. It's more than 22, and I have presided over virtually every kind of case. And one of the most important things I've done over those years is to preside over my courts, the DC Superior Court's drug court. And I'd always known the importance of toxicology work, and I'd seen it in murder trials. I'd seen it in lots of different things. It is of critical importance in impaired driving, which is all of you know is such a significant threat to the health and well-being of everybody in the country. And I'm not the expert. The experts are the three panelists I'm about to introduce. Let me, before I say anything more, though, I want to thank the Council for Court Excellence and Katie McConville and Aishma Bistola for all that they have done to help make this presentation possible. So here's what we're going to do. I'm welcoming people from all over the country, not just from the District of Columbia. All of you know how important it is to reduce impaired driving. So we're going to hear from three toxicologists. We're going to have time for questions and follow-up. And I just want to go now to the introduction of the speakers and to tell you what we're going to do. Our first speaker will be Dr. Stephen Raso. Dr. Raso is a board-certified forensic toxicologist. He has a doctorate PhD in analytical chemistry, an MS in forensic science, and a bachelor's in both chemistry and forensic and investigative science. He received a research fellowship from the National Institute of Justice to perform his doctoral research on the pyrolysis, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, of synthetic cannabinoids. He worked as a research scientist at Quest Diagnostics. He currently serves as the Deputy Chief Toxicologist at the Washington, D.C. office of the Chief Medical Examiner. As a judge, I can tell you the Office of Chief Medical Examiner does fantastic work. I've been to their lab. They are just terrific, and they're really important. Dr. Raso has published in the Journal of Analytical Toxicology. He has a passion for innovation and technology and is a solutions-based leader. He's also an active member of multiple organizations, including the American Academy of Forensic Sciences and the Society of Forensic Toxicologists, where he's currently the chair of the Publications Committee. And we all know how important publications are in this area and how much we rely on them. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Sabra Jones. Dr. Jones is a board-certified forensic toxicologist specializing in the interpretation of toxicological, let me try it again, evidence in impaired driving cases. She serves as the regional toxicology liaison for the Northeastern United States. She supports forensic toxicology laboratories and justice system partners across the NHTSA regions 1, 2, and 3. Dr. Jones provides training and technical assistance focused on scientific reliability, evidentiary interpretation, and clear communication of toxicology findings for court proceedings. And that clear communication is something that, as a judge, I really depend on. The lawyers really depend on, lawyers from both sides. Finally, we'll hear from Amy Miles. She is a program project manager at the Wisconsin State Laboratory of Hygiene, a very well-respected lab, and serves as a regional toxicology liaison for the Midwest. She has more than 25 years of experience and is involved in public health issues related to forensic toxicology. And she is also a co-chair of the Association of Public Health Laboratories Overdose Biosurveillance Task Force, which offers resources to public health laboratories performing non-fatal overdose surveillance testing. She is the past the past president of the Society of Forensic Toxicologists, and she's also a National Judicial College faculty member, and that's where judges train. She also partners with the University of Wisconsin, where she was recently awarded distinguished status on research projects focusing on impaired driving and drugs and human performance, something that all of you are interested in. She has contributed to many articles in national publications, has received many public health and public service related awards, and she's a member of several professional organization committees pertaining to alcohol, drugs, and human performance in public health. So this is truly a stellar group. I want to stop talking now and let you hear from the experts. We'll start first with Dr. Raso.
Right. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me today. So I'm going to start off doing a little bit of brief stuff about the testing and what we see here in the District of Columbia, as previously mentioned. I'm not the chief toxicologist. I will correct. I'm the deputy chief toxicologist. So I've been here in DC for a number of years, and so we'll talk a little bit about the testing that we do here, and hopefully be a good springboard into the other speakers as they get going as well. Let's see if I have control of this. Oh, looks like it. Okay, so we're going to talk about the perspective from the toxicologist, especially when it comes into account of the impaired driving area. So it's important to know that us as the toxicologist, we are a resource to our stakeholders, whether that's, could be law enforcement, it could be prosecutors, it could be defense attorneys, it could be judges, it could be whoever is, looking to get any kind of testing from a toxicology perspective done. We are a resource to them. Typically here at DC-OCME, when speaking about impaired driving specifically, the specimens we're generally getting are urine and blood. DC is majority a urine jurisdiction, so we get many, many more urine specimens submitted versus blood, but that will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction across the country. I will briefly mention, because I believe someone submitted a question about oral fluids. It is something that the DC lab is starting to look into. There's a partnering project with the Highway Safety Office to start to evaluate if we could do some oral fluid testing for the district. So at the moment we do not, but maybe in a year or 2 years, if this talk was given again, that might be different. So we'll see where that research goes. And so again, we're going to provide guidance on the cases, and then we can review, explain, and interpret the results that we obtain. It's really important that it's more of the guidance, right? Toxicologists, generally, we're not on the scene. I'm not there. I'm not on the roadside. I don't see them. I don't get to view their impairment or lack thereof. We're getting a, analytical testing result, and we can provide that information to the stakeholder and kind of give them some guidance on what that may or may not mean for what may have been seen on the roadside itself. So I'm going to start with alcohol here in the district. So outside of that urine and blood that I spoke about, we also do the breath alcohol testing here for the district. So some baseline statistics that we see from our breath alcohol perspective here in the DC. You can see the majority of the cases we see fall within the range of 0.1 to 0.19, which is above the per se limit of 0.08 here in the district. But we've definitely seen higher ones as we move forward. As I show there, the other one that has been on the rise, or one of the levels that have been on the rise, is actually really low level. breath alcohol, the 0.01 to 0.04. And I'll also show, if you see, been a big increase over the last year to 2 years of no result, which is interesting and important to note because they were pulled over for some reason. The officers have, looked, or the driver seems to be impaired. And if they're getting no breath alcohol result, it could be obviously from a drug impairment that has caused that. And so we have seen that, increase of possibly no breath alcohol results. But again, the flip side is maybe there is some drugs of impairment on board. But again, just a trend of note that we're seeing here in DC. So connecting that to blood alcohol first, the most common concentrations we're seeing in the DC are still within that same range, 0.08 to 0.19, which makes sense and is consistent since the blood alcohol and the breath alcohol concentrations should be fairly similar. So that makes sense that is our highest amount. I will again, I'll kind of point out here, if you notice how small the numbers are, maybe 20 to 30 cases annually. And that's again, because I mentioned DC is a urine jurisdiction. So a lot of times these are our federal stakeholders like the U.S. Park Police, for example, that will, because they're federal, will submit the blood. So, little bits of grain of salt because it's a really small sample size that we see with the blood actually being submitted here in the district. So coincidentally, we see many more urine specimens being submitted. And so the biggest thing to note is obviously the concentrations are much higher. Right now, the most common concentrations that we see are above 0.2. Now, the thing to keep in mind here is we are now talking about urine and no longer the blood, which means this is alcohol that has already passed through the system, has been cleared to the point that it's in our bladder and the urine is now excreting it. So a lot of times you'll get questions, or we'll get questions about, well, have they voided recently, or have they been holding their urine for a number of hours, right? So there's a lot of things you need to take into consideration when you're looking at urine concentrations, because it's not now a direct indicator of what's in that person's system at the time, right? It's an indicator of what has been consumed, what has been ingested and then gone through the body. And again, depending on that time frame of how long they have or have not been drinking, stopped drinking, have they urinated recently, you could have kind of like almost like a mini stockpile. So it's not, uncommon to see the higher concentrations, but it's good to understand that doesn't necessarily, mean higher impairment or higher levels in the blood, because we are talking about the urine. So you really got to understand the differences that we're seeing between the specimens that are being analyzed and being tested in your jurisdiction, depending on what is tested. Okay, so that's our quick snapshot of the alcohol. The other thing that is important to think about, as I kind of mentioned earlier, is drugs. You can also be impaired when you're driving by a number of drug compounds that may be depressive in nature, or maybe they're, hallucinogenic, anything that's kind of affecting our brain functions and how we're processing, because it's really important to know when we're driving. You could probably right now very quickly make a list of 20 to 30 things you do simultaneously when you drive. And so anything that we're affecting the speed or the efficiency of, how we're thinking and interpreting things, that can come out as an effect of an impairment, especially when driving a motor vehicle. So here is a snapshot of what we've seen in DC. These are the top 6 drugs of abuse that we see in our DUI population. Probably no surprise that ethanol is the highest, right? That's what we're going to see more often than any of the other drugs of abuse. Outside of that, DC is a very kind of traditional drug demographic. Outside of, some of our neighboring states, they differ a little bit, but generally our drug consumers are of an older population, an older demographic. And so we see a lot of more classical drugs of abuse. PCP is still pretty common here, which is not necessarily common in a lot of other cities. Cocaine, and then heroin, or as we see here, really has transitioned into fentanyl. As we know, that has been part of, the recent crises over the last decades or so. So I just want to zoom in here a little bit more to take the ethanol away so we can kind of see what the drugs of abuse are actually doing. So taking out the alcohol, just looking at the drugs of abuse, THC is our next highest. THC is, very common here in the district, decriminalized. So again, that's not a surprise that we see that in high amounts. Most of our cases, it looks like almost 50% at this point, have those. And then again, the classical. So again, I'm going to zoom in one more time just to take away that THC so we can see those drugs of abuse and what's going on with them. So zooming all the way in there, we can see cocaine has stayed the highest during this time period of 2022 to 2025. And PCP has always been the next highest. However, over the last couple of years, you see that has started to decline. And then interestingly, we've seen the fentanyl start to increase. I believe when fentanyl really came on board, whether people knew there was fentanyl in their heroin or didn't, we saw a lot of effects, obviously on the overdose side. But I think as fentanyl has been around longer, whether users are more comfortable with it, tolerances increase, maybe they're being a little bit more willing to drive, on their fentanyls and things of that nature. And so, these are just speculations, but when you're seeing the data increase, you can try to start to think of what are the causes of what might, be spurring that. And so we've started to see the fentanyl start to increase over the last year or two. And we'll see how that continues the trend. Or there's obviously a lot of other novel drugs that go out there, a lot of different benzodiazepines and non-opioid type drugs that, at least I can speak here in DC, we've been adding to our DUI testing panel last year in 2025 and 2026. So in the coming years, we can see how much we see those statistics go up and down, and how that affects these classical drugs if they go down, or they're being replaced by the novels and things. So we'll see where that goes, but they're all going to affect that drug impairment. So it's important for us to understand where they're going. So that is kind of a quick snapshot here of DC. For us, I believe there's some people maybe from DC, some people from obviously across the country. So I did wanted to leave, this is our email here at the OCME Toxicology Lab in case you ever do need us as a resource, or you have any questions about specifically what's going on around us. Don't be afraid to reach out. Again, we are a resource to anyone and all the stakeholders around us. So thank you guys very much. I will hand it off to Sabra. Thank you.
Okay, and let me just say thank you for a really good presentation. I'm sure it raises a lot of questions as well. So now we'll hear from Dr. Sabra Jones.
Excellent. Thank you, Judge, and fantastic presentation by Dr. Raso. As mentioned, my name is Sabra Jones, and I am the Regional Toxicology Liaison that gets the wonderful honor to support DC, in addition to about 15 other states and NHTSA regions 1 through 3, 2 U.S. territories as well. So I get to have a really great, fantastic snapshot of what happens across the Northeast region. And after me, you get to hear from my incredible boss, Amy Miles, who will share a bit more about our program. So with that, sorry, there we go. Oops. So rather than discussing like laboratory methods in depth, my goal today is going to be to provide a practical framework for evaluating toxicology evidence and understanding its strengths and its limitations. So we're going to begin by discussing why toxicology is important in our impaired driving cases and how alcohol cases differ from other drugs. We'll then examine some of the scientific challenges that are involved in interpreting toxicology results, including cannabis and polydrug use. And finally, we'll discuss some practical considerations for evaluating toxicology evidence in court and conclude with several key take-home messages. So rather than trying to remember every scientific detail we're going to discuss today, I'd like to leave you with 4 practical principles. And as we go through the presentation, I hope you'll think about how each of these topics kind of connects back to those ideas. And we're going to come back to those at the end. So let's begin by laying the foundation for why toxicology plays such an important role in our impaired driving cases. First of all, we heard from Judge Isco, impaired driving continues to be a significant public safety concern and contributes to serious injuries and fatalities every year. And drug-impaired driving cases often present more scientific complexity than our alcohol-only cases because the relationship between the drug concentrations and impairment is far less predictable. Toxicology provides one piece of the puzzle. Toxicology identifies substances present in a biological sample. However, a laboratory result alone does not establish impairment at the time of driving. The significance of a result depends on a number of factors, including what drug was involved, the timing of specimen collection, what specimen was collected, pharmacology, and other evidence in that particular case. So judges evaluate toxicology evidence alongside all the other facts that get presented in that particular impaired driving case. And one of the most common misconceptions is equating the presence of a drug with impairment. Scientific findings should always be considered within their proper limitations and alongside the totality of the evidence. So one key takeaway here would be positive doesn't always equal impaired, and we're going to talk about why that is. So alcohol is also unique because we have decades of research that has established a relatively predictable relationship between a blood alcohol concentration and a level of impairment. All the other drugs, the majority of them, just don't behave this way. Different drugs impair different skills, and the interpretation is dependent on timing, tolerance, and the totality of the evidence. So this slide about what toxicology can and cannot tell us really summarizes what toxicology contributes to our impaired driving casework. It identifies what substance is present, but the interpretation of the meaning of that really requires context. Drug concentrations will not tell us impairment by themselves. As I mentioned before, timing matters, and results should always be considered alongside the other evidence. So using toxicology to inform the court, it can't answer every single question. So up to this point, we've discussed what toxicology can and can't tell us. And next, I'd like to look at why interpreting toxicology evidence is often challenging in our real-world impaired driving cases. And honestly, the challenge isn't getting that result. It really comes down to understanding what that result means and what it may not be able to tell us. So alcohol really is the exception. I think most of us, for the most part, and judges included, are very familiar with this concept of blood alcohol concentration because alcohol has been studied extensively for almost 100 years. When we get to around 2030, we are going to be closer to 100 years in which we have known alcohol impairs our ability to safely operate a motor vehicle and been able to begin to measure it in the breath, in the blood, and other biological matrices. Now, while alcohol is not perfect, it is far more predictable in its relationship between the concentrations that we measure and impairment than our other substances that we encounter. But people respond differently to drugs. We heard from Dr. Raso, there are a number of factors, things like tolerance, metabolism, genetics, individuals who have medical conditions, and of course, the frequency of use all influence how a person gets affected by drugs. Two people with the same concentration may experience very different effects. Different drugs work through different mechanisms, and they can impair different aspects of driving performance. So a stimulant, an opioid, a benzodiazepine, and cannabis all affect the body differently. And this is one of the reasons there's no universal drug concentration that can reliably equate to a level of impairment. So if you will, just imagine you have two toxicology reports or two drivers with the same reported THC concentration. That THC meaning the primary psychoactive component of the cannabis plant. Let's say one of those individuals is an occasional user who consumed cannabis shortly before driving, smoked it just before driving. The other is a frequent cannabis user whose blood may have been collected several hours after the stop. And then, although those laboratory reports have that same concentration, the scientific interpretation may be very different. And this really illustrates why toxicology results must always be interpreted within the context of the case rather than relying on a single number. So for most drugs, the question isn't, what number proves impairment? The better question is, how does toxicology results fit with all the other evidence of the case? Now, cannabis deserves special attention because it's one of the most common drugs encountered in our impaired driving cases. And it's also one of the most misunderstood. In around 2022, NHTSA released a study evaluating impairing substances in serious and fatally injured road users. And it was one of the first times where you begin to see where cannabis, and they were specifically looking at the psychoactive drug as well as the primary psychoactive metabolite outranked alcohol in this particular study. And the study was looking at various geographic regions across the United States. Unlike alcohol, though, THC does not have a simple, predictable relationship between blood concentration and impairment. THC is rapidly distributed throughout the body after smoking. Blood concentrations often peak very quickly, and then they decline rapidly, even though the impairing effects are persisting. Conversely, if you have an individual who is a chronic or heavy user of cannabis, they can have measurable THC in their blood long after the impairing effects have resolved. And what if they, instead of smoking, they have ingested or consumed a cannabis product like an edible? This changes when the drug hits their system and influence our interpretation of those results. The effects of cannabis depend on a number of factors, including the dose or the potency. We now have cannabis products with potency that we have never seen before. Probably for some of us who've been around for a few decades in the field, we didn't even know it was possible, and yet they are available to consumers. Other factors include how was the drug entered into the body or route of administration. Also, the individual's experience with cannabis, their tolerance to the drug, and the time since they use. So two people using the exact same product at the same dose can have very different levels of experience based on all those number of factors. Timing is also incredibly important in cannabis cases. A blood specimen collected 1, 2, or 3 hours after driving may look very different, even though it's actually reflecting that same driving event. And Dr. Raso mentioned that they are a urine jurisdiction, which in the US, we have a few of those. So specimen type influences the toxicologist's interpretation. It's also really important to distinguish between parent drug, which reflects relatively recent use, and inactive metabolites, which you may see more of in the urine, which might just indicate a prior exposure rather than current impairment. Laws regarding THC limits vary considerably among jurisdictions, and the scientific support for a specific per se or level remains an area of ongoing discussion. So the best approach is to evaluate cannabis toxicology alongside driving behavior, results of standardized field sobriety tests. If you're lucky to have a DRE involved, what were their observations or their findings, as well as any other relevant information that's important for that particular case. But cannabis really illustrates why drug toxicology requires interpretation and not simply reading a number. So unfortunately, polydrug use is the new normal and has been for a bit of time now. In many impaired driving cases, we are seeing 2 or more impairing substances present, making interpretation far more complex than evaluating a single drug. Toxicologists must consider how multiple substances may interact with each other and contribute to impairment. But those results cannot be interpreted in isolation. As we discussed throughout the presentation, toxicology is most meaningful when it's considered alongside the facts and circumstances of that particular case. The more substances involved, the more important context becomes. So rather than focusing on finding that single right answer, judges can often gain the greatest value through questions that clarify what the toxicology evidence does and does not support. So toxicologists can help explain how laboratory findings relate to timing, pharmacology, expected effects, and limitations of the interpretation. They can also explain why different specimen types answer different scientific questions. Toxicology should also be considered with all those other things that we talked about, like driving behavior, officer observations, witness testimony, and any other relevant information. That laboratory result alone, it's just one component of the overall evidentiary picture. A qualified expert should be comfortable with discussing both the strengths and the limitations of the evidence. Scientific opinions are strongest when they clearly explain what conclusions are supported and where uncertainty might still remain. So some useful questions might be, what does this test actually demonstrate? When was the specimen collected? What was tested? Are there alternative explanations for the findings? Or are the conclusions consistent with the scientific literature? So the best expert testimony, it does not eliminate uncertainty, it explains it. So when listening to an expert provide testimony, I encourage you to think about 4 questions. What does this result actually show? Exposure or impairment? Recent or past use? How does it fit with the other case information? Is it consistent with the observation? Should there be other evidence that needs to be considered? What conclusions are supported? Is the opinion within the science? Are they explaining uncertainty? Are they addressing the limitations, such as timing of collection or what specimen is being tested? So we've discussed the science behind toxicology interpretation and some of the challenges that are unique to drug-impaired driving cases. And I'd like to conclude with focusing on practical considerations that may assist courts when evaluating toxicology evidence. There will be case-defining information. For example, time of sample collection in relation to when they used. Those toxicology results should be considered within the context of the case, which I've said several times, and experts should provide education on what the results mean and clarify any uncertainties. And as the landscape of drug use changes, do exactly what you're doing today. Try to stay current as possible. So at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned there were 4 ideas that I hope you would remember. Everything we've discussed today really comes back to these 4 principles. Positive doesn't necessarily equal impaired. A positive toxicology result just established that a substance was detected. It does not by itself establish impairment at the time of driving. Interpretation requires context. Timing, specimen type, pharmacology, individual variability, and the surrounding facts all influence how toxicology results should be interpreted. Consider the totality of the evidence. The most reliable conclusions come from integrating those laboratory findings with driving behavior and all those other things we talked about, like officer observations, DRE evaluations when available, witness testimony, and any other relevant information. And then scientific limitations strengthen good decision-making. Understanding the limits of the science doesn't weaken the judicial process. It strengthens it by helping ensure that evidence is interpreted fairly, accurately, and within its proper scope. So I want to thank you for your time and your attention today. I really do hope these concepts provide a useful framework for understanding toxicology evidence in impaired driving cases. And with that, I'll pass it over to my incredible boss, Amy Miles.
Okay, and thank you, Dr. Jones. Before we go to Amy Miles, I want to say we've now had two excellent presentations. And one other thing to think about, we've talked about toxicology and impaired driving, and that's the focus of this presentation. But related to that is the question of detection of new use of drugs by people who are in diversion programs or on pretrial release or on probation. And there's a lot of discussion there about, and we'll get to it more, but I just want everybody in the audience as well as the presenters to be thinking about the questions that judges and lawyers and defendants face in distinguishing new use from residual use, particularly problematic in THC. And but with that, I want to thank you for your great presentation, and let's turn to Amy Miles.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to Dr. Raso and Dr. Jones for the lead-in. I'm going to take essentially what both of them have talked about and relate it to what we now know as the Regional Toxicology Liaisons Program, or the RTLs. So while Dr. Raso gave you a really great overview of what they do at their lab and specific to DC, and then Sabra kind of brought it out to a more broad, I'm going to talk about essentially what Sabra started with of the why it matters, but in context of the RTO program. So you've heard from two of my esteemed colleagues, two toxicologists, that have talked about all of the reasons why toxicology matters. I always felt like through my career, the toxicologist was in the classroom with all the other forensic disciplines like DNA and drug chemistry, but we were always the kid in the back just constantly raising our hands saying, ooh, 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 pick me, pick me. It just seemed like we could never get the recognition we needed. So finally, we're at this point now where we've come to understand there is this increasing drug diversity. We know, as Sabra mentioned, polysubstance use is incredibly on the rise. And we also have this issue now that was something that we've come to call novel psychoactive substances, or NPS, whereby these are compounds that are new to us and constantly changing. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then also cannabis products. Sabra and Dr. Raso both talked about THC and cannabis, but we're seeing cannabis like we never have before. And it's very evident that the science has not caught up to what we're seeing today, because a lot of what's being consumed in those products, those concentrations within the product themselves are so much greater than what we've ever seen or can study. So given all of those, plus the evolving testing technologies, we know this has created a challenge for the courts. And so the RTL program, one of our goals has been not only to help laboratories and help them remove barriers and pinch points, but to also educate the courts so that they can fully understand our challenges and what we need to be able to provide the best information for them. So Sabra mentioned already, toxicology has its limitations. And if we don't have all of the information, it is impossible for us to provide you with the best information for you to make your decisions. I've testified over 300 times now. I've been in courts with judges where I've written an opinion letter, I've provided it to the courts, I show up in trial, and then all of a sudden new evidence is presented to me that I didn't know about before. And so now I'm having to modify what was written in my opinion. And judges ask me, well, so now you're going to change your mind because you're going to change it based on whatever you've just heard. And my answer is always yes. I equate toxicology very much to my car. So if my car is leaking oil, I can call my mechanic and they can troubleshoot over the phone and they can tell me a few things, but until I actually bring the entire car to the shop and they can, put it up and look at it, they can't give me the full understanding and identify what's going on. Same thing with toxicology. We can give you a lot of information based on our test result, but we must provide it evaluating all of the evidence. So observations, so those standardized field sobriety tests, drug recognition expert or evaluator, depending on where you're at, DRE findings, the tox results, witness statements, crash evidence, all of those things. We can't rely on just one single data point, and you don't want us to do that. So Sabra mentioned there are a lot of things that have to go into understanding that toxicology result, and we are limited if we don't have some of that information, but we can tell you a lot. If we have nothing else in a case other than our test result, we can tell you a lot. We can talk about our analytical scope, meaning what drugs do we test for? Our limitations in testing. Maybe we can't test for everything. Uncertainty, we have something in our field called measurement uncertainty. Maybe you've heard that thrown around a little bit, but most labs have implemented MU or measurement uncertainty, and we're going to talk about that. And that's really important too, and it'll tell you a lot about our test. And then again, Sabra and Dr. Raso both said this. We have to remember that the number isn't always what's so important. And I think we've done ourselves a little bit of a disservice by creating these per se or illegal limits. Because in doing so, especially for alcohol, we've told people it is okay to drink and drive. Just don't do it once you've reached a 0.08, or if you're in Utah, a 0.05. But we all know there is no one individual that's sitting at the bar and they say, oh, I just can't order another martini. I'm right at a 0.075. No one knows that number. And so to assume that by putting out this per se limit, people will not drink and drive, we know that hasn't worked. We've seen it. And so it's even more difficult when, as Sabra demonstrated with cannabis specifically, when we talk about those per se limits with THC, all bets are off. No one knows when they're consuming their THC product what their blood concentration is. So all of these bring up these considerations that we need to have in toxicology evidence. One of the things that we've been working on through the RTL program is supporting drug recognition practices. So that's not just drug recognition experts, but that's a lot of other things. So it was mentioned earlier about oral fluid testing, specifically for screening at the roadside. There are a number of states, including my own Wisconsin, that we have laws now that allow for us to use devices at the roadside for law enforcement to be able to determine positive or negative presence of a drug. So again, this is not telling them if they're impaired. This is just an additional tool they're using as they're collecting their observations of impairment. We've gotten better toxicology methods where it used to be that, we would do a screening test, and maybe that would give us positive or negative for groups of drugs. Then we'd have to do another test and figure out, okay, if it's positive for this group of drugs, which drug is it? Then we'd have to do another test and figure out for sure which drug it is, maybe give you a number. And we just didn't have panels. Now we're moving more into these improved toxicology methods where we're looking for multiple things within just one fell swoop. And we're working towards better data integration. I think this one's really important, especially for those of you that are in treatment court situations. We as toxicologists, about half of us in the country, we do something called stop testing. And that means once we've tested a sample for alcohol, if the alcohol exceeds either a 0.08 or a 0.1, it depends on your state and your lab, we will not perform drug testing. And as you can imagine, from a treatment court standpoint, if we're only telling you this person has alcohol in their system, but they actually also co-consume cannabis, opioids, or anything else, for you to be able to make your decisions and your determinations and treatment, it gets really difficult. And the data that we're reporting out from our labs is biased towards alcohol because we focus on alcohol. So we're working to better identify those labs that are doing that practice, find ways to work around that practice, and just have better data integration. And then identification of emerging drugs. That's always been really difficult. Even the greatest of labs like Dr. Raso's and some of these other laboratories that we work with across the country, they have the best technology and the best methods, but they're still not able to identify every single drug that's possible out there. So we're trying to work toward these broader analytical panels. If you want to impress your friends and family tonight at dinner, you can talk about what we call quadruple time of flight, a QTOF. A lot of laboratories are implementing that sort of testing because it really does open up the ability to see more of those compounds that we have a hard time detecting. This was mentioned, I think, by Dr. Raso, oral fluid testing. We're sort of seeing this movement now. There are 2 states or 3 states that do laboratory-based oral fluid testing. So it's the same idea as the devices, roadside devices, but law enforcement can collect a sample and then send it to a laboratory. And then we can actually use it and run it against our large panels and try to tell you which drug is present. So a lot of us are moving more towards oral fluid testing. And those NPS drugs are those novel psychoactive substances. Again, that instrument I talked about earlier, the QTOF. Most of us that have that, we're able to identify a lot of adjacent substances. So like fentanyl was, Dr. Raso was talking about fentanyl. We can kind of tell our instrument, okay, if it sort of looks like fentanyl, let us know, because those compounds change almost quarterly and it's really tough to keep up with all of them. We're also working toward consensus standards. So in all of the forensic disciplines, they're all working towards some sort of standardization and some sort of consensus. And forensic toxicology is actually leading that effort. And I'm really proud to say Dr. Sabra Jones has been a part of that effort. And we are now at the point where we're letting labs know, if you're going to do impaired driving testing, we really want you to be testing for these drugs at these concentrations so that we're all doing the same testing at the same cutoffs or positive and negative determinations. And then reporting. We find that labs report things differently all over the place. And I've said this, I don't know how many times now, you walk into one forensic lab, you've walked into one forensic lab. We may all have some of the same foundational pieces of instrumentation and equipment, but when it comes down to reporting and some of those other nuances of the laboratories, where almost all of us are doing them differently. And so that leaves you and the courts to have to try to interpret them as well. So as much of a relationship as you can have with the toxicologist so we can help you understand what those differences and those nuances are. So as Sabra mentioned, we get these really common scientific questions for the courts. What does the result mean? Does detection mean impairment? How do all these substances interact with each other? What are the limitations of testing and interpretation? And these are all, unfortunately, still questions we're trying to answer. What does the result mean? It depends. And I hate to say that because we say that a lot. We do a lot of work with all rise, and a lot of our answers with all rise are, it depends. If we're talking about a treatment court situation, what does the result mean may depend on what is our matrix. So like Sabra was talking about, is it urine? Is it oral fluid? What are we testing? How often are you testing? In an impaired driving case, the result may just mean we have detection of a drug, and that's all we can say. So there's a lot of limitations in toxicology, and I know oftentimes we look to it as being this panacea of all results and all information, but it's not. And that's why we work together with defense, with prosecution, with law enforcement and judges so that we can all have a better understanding of what we're dealing with and what we need to move forward and have the best information and the best answers we can have. So because of all of these questions and all of the differences within forensic toxicology labs, the RTL program was born. In 2021, there was a cooperative agreement that we signed between the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, or NHTSA, and the Society of Forensic Toxicologists. And this was really to strengthen that integration that we needed between forensic toxicology and, quite honestly, to give forensic toxicology a voice. As I said before, I always felt like DNA had it so easy because they always get really great funding because it's tied into their accreditation standards and guidelines. We don't have that with forensic toxicology. So if you want us to do more testing, do better testing, I hate to say it, but it always comes down to the F word, funding. So really raising a voice for forensic toxicology is the complete underlying message from the RTL program. So we serve as resources and we connect folks across those disciplines, both laboratories and the judiciary. So some of you may have already seen us. We do the best that we can to get to every judicial education conference. The JOLs are really important for us to be able to have a voice as well. We provide scientific consultation. Oftentimes we'll get judges that just have very general and basic questions about overviews of toxicology, and we're always happy to answer those questions. Again, we give presentations all across the country to judges everywhere about emerging drug trends, and we can always connect folks to subject matter experts. The RTLs, between the 5 of us, we are a pretty smart group, but we don't always know everything, but we know a lot of people. So we can always connect folks up to subject matter experts if needed. We also have provided testimony and standards resources, so helping laboratories and toxicologists be able to meet and implement standards. And again, it's just that multidisciplinary collaboration. We've learned as we've done the RTL program, while we work with the labs as our primary goal, we find we spend more time just doing training and education with folks like the judiciary because we just haven't had that opportunity and we haven't had those people that could do that before. So we know that, you know, the courts are also facing those evolving drugs just like we do, especially in treatment court. We know that you're going to have folks that are going to try to evade your testing. We know that there's changing technology and that the scientific evidence continues to be complex and different. If anybody's heard of the Smith, Arizona versus Smith case, you know, that's one of those where, you know, the science within that case is actually very different than forensic toxicology. So when we try to translate that across to toxicology, it's really frustrating. So the RTLs are there to try to help people understand what the evidence-based information is so that in the end, the decisions you're making in your courtroom are based on unbiased information, fair information with integrity so that you're doing the best possible job that you can. You can engage us through our training programs. Again, we're happy to come and speak to anybody. If you just want a quick one-on-one with us, we can always just hop on a Zoom with you. If you have a really specific situation and you want information, we're happy to do that. Like today, we participate in webinars. Those are easier for us because we can do them anywhere. We connect you with the current science, the standards, the publications. A couple of us still have affiliations through universities. So if there's publications that you want, we can usually access those for you and get them to you and help you. The standards that we abide by, those are all public-facing documents. And if you're interested in more information on our standards, we can absolutely help you with that and get you more information. So when we first started the RTL program from 2021 to 2024, NHTSA actually chose the regions that we would represent. So we started out in NHTSA's regions 5, 7, and 9. And so those are the color-coded states that you see there. We made a very conscious decision that we were going to start low and slow, kind of grow as slowly as we could because we wanted to make sure we built a really solid foundation for this program, which we did. So in 2025, we expanded the program. At the beginning of the program, NHTSA actually had Sabra in the Midwest, but she's in Boston. So once we had the opportunity to expand, we told Sabra, you can stay home a little more. I think she probably travels more now than she did before. But now Sabra's up there in the Northeast, and we were able to kind of fill in some of those gaps that we had in the middle part of the country. And then this year, we were able to hire another RTL. So now there's 5 of us, and we have almost completely covered the entire country at this point. Just because we don't quite cover that southeast part of the country doesn't mean we haven't helped those states. And again, we know a lot of folks. So if we can't help them, we know folks in those states that could be great references or subject matter experts that could help them. But we're hoping then within the next year or so to be able to cover that last gap And then maybe we'll turn on to global domination at that point. We'll see. So this is the 5 of us. These are all the states that we represent. And again, we're slowly making our way to covering all of the country, but we're not quite there yet, but we should be there hopefully, within the next year or so. So we'll be looking to hire at least one more. But I will say, when I first hired Sabra, Chris, and Kristen, I said to them, I think this will be a full-time job. I'm not sure because we had really no roadmap or idea of how this was going to go. But I can say with absolute certainty, it has become a very full-time job. And I think what's made it that way is not just helping the laboratories and getting them the resources, but it's been the engagement, especially with the judiciary and the JOLs and the judges, has been just such a tremendous partnership. And through that partnership, we find that we're more busy trying to help out everyone to understand and identify toxicology needs. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to get on my RTL soapbox. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, Amy. And let me just add a little to that soapbox. The RTLs have been of invaluable assistance to me, and I know to judges throughout the country, as has the NHTSA program of having liaisons in toxicology, and then the judicial liaisons. There's and other kinds of liaisons as well. I won't discuss them now, except I'm going to make one more comment on funding. But first, I want to encourage everybody in the audience, if you have questions, please submit them. You can start writing those questions while I'm talking. But I'm going to pick up on one thing Amy said and everybody's hinted at, that F word, funding, is critical. When she mentions cutting off testing when you reach a positive for alcohol. Why don't you test for other things? Because it's expensive, because it costs a lot of money. Is it helpful to have that information? Absolutely. And in treatment courts, where we're lucky enough in DC to right now have that testing, I'll see where somebody, they were very high on alcohol when they came into the court. Now alcohol is gone, but look, cocaine is way up. They're using a lot of cocaine, and there was some coke in their system at the time of their alcohol. So if we'd stopped only at alcohol, I wouldn't have known that, and judges wouldn't know that. So I want to thank all 3 of you. I just got a question. I am not able. Let me see if I can open the question box. I am not right now. So I'm going to ask Ayushma or Katie. I've got plenty of questions to ask, but I'd really like to have the questions from the audience answered. So Katie or Ayushma, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you, Judges Go. The first question is, what capacity does the current technology have to determine time of use? Can you determine when substances were consumed?
Who wants to
I
tackle it?
saw multiple people. Yes.
Amy, you go first.
So I guess the short answer to that is no, we can't tell time of use, not even for alcohol. We can extrapolate back in time for a blood alcohol concentration, but we can't determine time of use. And I don't know if Sabra or Dr. Raso, if you want to add on to that.
I'll add on that I agree. There's too many, variables, as Amy mentioned, even with alcohol that we know so much more about, that does allow us in ways to do some extrapolations. It still doesn't tell you how much was drank, right? There's a large kind of trajectory that users go on, right? They have to ingest it. It has to get into their bloodstream, and then eventually it's cleared. What if they drink again or take another dose? How does that affect that trajectory, right? So there's too many things to know. I guess I said that we don't know, to make strong, confident, determinations about when something was actually consumed.
And I am now able to open the questions. So let me go. Sabra, did you want to add something to that or not?
No, they nailed it. Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Well, great. Here's a question. Can you discuss where the quantitative test is widely available at the national level and how you identify whether a novel drug detected has an impairing effect? So it's a tough question.
That's a
Amy,
good.
go ahead.
The quadruple time of flight or QTOF instrument is available. However, I'm going to go back to the F word there. It's always funding. That's probably a $500,000 instrument all in. And so a lot of laboratories just cannot afford that. So there are alternative instruments to that can be used, that are used, that are good. It's nice because the QTOF has a predictive ability within it to be able to kind of model across different substances. Does anybody else want to tackle how do you identify whether a novel drug detected has an impairing effect?
I actually wanted to touch on something too that has come up in multiple states that we support, and that is sometimes the State Highway Safety Office has funding to acquire a new instrument, and yet space is gone in that laboratory. There is no longer an adequate, appropriate space for that instrument to actually exist. So it can be as important as the funding piece is, can that laboratory expand their capacity in the space that they have? And
Let me
so,
interrupt for a second. You're just talking about actual physical space in the lab because
yes,
there's so many machines.
yeah. And so it's super interesting. New Hampshire is an example where they literally had no more outlets, appropriate outlets that they could install and place another instrument because they were at capacity. And several labs are in that situation, trying to find ways that they can expand their testing when they're constrained to this physical space. So it does really require great communication with the laboratory on what are their needs beyond just funding, but also what other considerations need to happen. But to piggyback on that second part of that question about
Sabra, sorry, just before you change the subject, and I'll let you get back. Other things to consider. We have QTOFs here, and some of the things we don't consider because we're scientists, we're thinking about the instrument and it's, putting it online. Something like the QTOF, it is a beast of data. So other things you have to consider, laboratories like us, you have to have a server. Like, I don't know anything about servers and networks. Like, there are things that we don't think about, but again, come back to the funding. That's not just, oh, here's an instrument, go buy an instrument. You can turn it on and start analyzing. Like, these produce incredibly large amounts of information. So the labs have to have the infrastructure to support that, to even begin testing, to get that information. So sorry to interrupt. I think that's an important part, and then we can move on.
No, that's fantastic. And I was just going to say, and please jump in, when it comes to NPS substances, novel psychoactive substances, new drugs, and this can be new pharmaceutical drugs too, and things of that nature. There's always this lag time. And when we identify this substance and then find out more information about the impairing effects. And I think this is where looking at toxicology results within the context of a case are incredibly important. Because if the law enforcement officer, witnesses, DRE are talking about the observations of impairment, even if we're limited in what we can say, you have that information of documenting observations of impairment, and that's incredibly important. But yeah.
Well, that was an excellent question. And I think part of the response, physical space, server capacity, are things that had not occurred to me. And I'm sure to many others, but they are legitimate concerns, and they do all relate to funding. I've got another question. Let's see whether you can answer this one. Does data support that substance abuse increases the risk of road rage incidents? So I don't know if anybody take a volunteer. among the three panelists?
I guess I'll start. This is just my opinion, my interpretations, right? There's not like a road rage receptor in our bodies, right? So there's not like a drug that's like, oh, it's going to trigger rage or anger in somebody, right? But what we do know is when you're under impairment or abuse of different drugs, it does affect our brains in certain ways. Specifically, like we talk about alcohol, it limits our inhibitions, right? So maybe someone says something rude to me, where typically I can have that filter on my brain and I'm like, I'm just going to let it go. It's not a big deal. When you inhibit those inhibitions, if you will, and someone says that same rude thing to me, well, I don't have that filter anymore. Maybe I snap back and say something rude to them. Now that's on a small scale. You can have the same scale if someone gets angry. So it's not that the drugs of abuse like make someone angry, but it does produce an environment where they might react in an angry way that they normally wouldn't.
I think that's an excellent a point, and it's not something you can quantify, but it's something to be considered. Let me ask sort of a general question. All three of you have pointed out the importance of considering toxicology results in a broader context of don't just look at the number, look at the overall behavior. There are this standard field sobriety tests all of you are generally familiar with. Are you aware of any data or studies that calibrate or that have compared how accurate the SFTs are, field sobriety tests are in detecting the impairment and compared to toxicology? I'm not seeing volunteers.
I would say, again, this kind of goes back to my rant about per se and a number. We've put so much reliance on you have to have X amount of indicators on HGN or horizontal gaze nystagmus. You have to have X amount of indicators on the walk and turn and so forth, that I think we've forgotten the whole point of the tests are just very simple tests. You can do them even when you have not been consuming any substance. And they are very sensitive to tell us if an individual can't remember an piece of information that was provided to them 5 seconds ago, or if they're falling all over the place, or even just simply can't close their eyes and count. Those are all things that are identifiable observations of impairment, and the field sobriety tests are very good for that purpose. They may not be as sensitive with certain drugs, like we're seeing with cannabis, that when we add in the entire DRE protocol, there's far more information to see about that impairment, and maybe the SFSTs aren't as sensitive, but that doesn't mean that they're still not providing value in giving us information. I don't know if anybody else has anything to add to that.
Any volunteers?
Yeah, no, Amy, I knew Amy would do that, answer it beautifully. So yeah.
It was a great answer. And I will say that at least in the District of Columbia, there was a recent decision that basically affirmed that said you don't need toxicology results based on the entire behavior at the scene to find that the driver was impaired. And I thought it was quite useful because I'm not going to go over the facts, but when you look at all the facts of the case, you go, that sounds like somebody who's impaired. And that's what they said. It was, you could find that beyond a reasonable doubt, a judge was, there was a review of a magistrate judge decision who'd made the finding that the person was operating while impaired. And that was I thought, quite useful. And I think we need to work on making judges aware of that, and also try to say, as all of you point out, toxicology is just one of many things to consider. Let me ask, first of all, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to chime in again.
Oh, no, I'd love to hear from you.
I think Amy really laid it out well that the SFTS, it's so useful, the DREs they work. But kind of on the same point where she has pointed out that we kind of back ourselves in a corner and we're saying you have to have this, you have to have that. Here, we don't have DREs in DC, but we have the field sobriety test trainings. And I have had cases here where they've gone through, the SFTs, and they say, I think they were impaired by an opioid. And so they go to testing, and we didn't find an opioid. We did find another drug that was impairing him, but it's not what the officer thought at the time. And it was a case that I ended up not moving forward with because they were pushing back that says, well, hey, the officer pulled me over and said I was high on an opiate, and I wasn't. So it's just, all the things to take into consideration, all the different aspects that can be in, and everything is different. So just to, I guess, shed some light on the other side of that coin, if we force ourselves into that pigeonhole too much.
Well, and I'm so happy you brought that up because I just had this come up on Monday. I was in Tennessee for a judicial conference, and the question came up from those judges where, well, what if we have a tox report that says no drugs detected, but we have this information from the officer that they shouldn't have been driving or they were impaired. And that just goes back to, we do the best we can in toxicology, but we're not going to always be that final answer. And that's why, you have to take it into context of everything else. No matter how hard we try, no matter what grade of a lab we are, we're still going to miss drugs that are out there that are trending that we just don't detect.
I think excellent point. There can also be prescription drugs, tiredness, all kinds of other things that could exacerbate the influence of even small amounts of other substances or could cause impairment in and of themselves.
And timing, right? A lot of times, depending on the concentration and depending on the drug, by the time someone was pulled over, they're taken to the precinct, they're going through paperwork, and maybe they get to a hospital, whatever their procedures are. I mean, you could be 2 hours, 3 hours past. Well, again, as Amy said, we can only do so much. What if it's just below our limitations of an analytical scope and testing? And so it may appear to be nothing was there, but maybe it was at the time. Like, that's just one, example. So there's a lot of different things that are at play here. And so I know we have conversations so no drugs detected, like that doesn't mean nothing was there. It just means nothing that I tested for at the limitations of my lab were there.
Very good points by all of you. There are a couple more questions that have come in I'd like to ask you about. Dr. Raso just referred to no DRE in DC, drug recognition experts. But from all of you, the question is, has DRE training become more commonplace? And just very quickly, your impressions on that.
I would say from our interactions and getting to support our law enforcement partners and getting to help with their DRE trainings, recertifications, I would say yes. DREs across the country, they are some of the smartest and most brightest law enforcement officers and very passionate about reducing and preventing impaired driving. And that's why they are willing to go through so much to become a DRE. So the training is so extensive. But the problem is they get promoted and they get, they are no longer able to be a DRE necessarily. They especially get promoted to a different unit and it's no longer feasible for them to also be a DRE. Some people stay, and they get to keep them. But so you do see turnover and fluctuation in numbers across the US. I was just in Vermont a few months back to do a DRE training and recertification. And some of those folks looked so young, and I just thought to myself, oh man, how long will they get to keep these individuals who are so passionate and knowledgeable? But so like anything, the numbers go up and then they go down. And some states are incredibly good at keeping their numbers up for their DREs. So I'll let Amy too. I'm sure she's got some great insight.
No, I agree. As through the RTL program, we've worked with a lot of states, and we are seeing more and more DREs. We just wish we could keep them because they do tend to promote. But you as a toxicologist, I will read a police report in a case that I'm going to testify in, and I can tell the difference between somebody that's not trained in observing drug impairment versus someone that is. And so the DREs are just really helpful in that way.
And can I ask a follow-up? Because I know we have the A-RIDE program, which is sort of that step between just a law enforcement officer who's been trained for standardized field sobriety tests and not quite a DRE. Does DC do A-RIDE training by any chance?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Great. Great. I was just curious if that was offered to them as well.
And do you find that helpful, Dr. Raso?
That they have that?
Yeah.
I guess I don't know personally, obviously. So I actually find it interesting that Amy gets to see police reports. We don't. So I don't get to see the difference between those. I would imagine it's helpful. I would have to say the more training they have to, make an informed decision would be the best. But I don't personally get to see the documentation differences to see if it's different.
Thank you. There's some other good questions. We're about to run out of time, but let me just go through a couple of them. One, a very important question is, how does judging or determining impairment work with racial bias? Isn't there an increased risk of judging someone being impaired if someone is of a different race, et cetera? And I'll just give my quick comment that it's very important to always look for racial bias. Defense attorneys do a good job of that, but I think judges should be aware of that as well. And the standard field sobriety tests have a number of objective factors. How many times did they stumble? What was the HGN score? All those kind of things. But there's general interpretations, and then there's also issues of when do they administer that, when do they give a stern warning and not make somebody leave the car. And I'm not talking about any case I'm familiar with. I'm just talking about nationally. That is a possibility. I don't, and so it's something that we should really work against, having racial bias in any way influence a decision whether to arrest, whether to prosecute, and whether to find somebody guilty, because it can occur at any of those phases. I don't know that any of the toxicologists have any views on that, but it looks like Dr. Jones is nodding. I didn't know if you wanted to add anything.
No, I was just agreeing. I getting the opportunity to go to like conferences like Lifesavers and others, where you get to see researchers specifically who focus in on these topics. But I mean, me personally, it just, at least in my experience, hasn't trickled down to the toxicologist level, honestly, where we would ever be quite kind of called in to provide any kind of subject matter expertise in that type of research and understanding of that.
Okay, thank you. There are a couple of other questions. One is DC specific. What is DC doing to prevent drunk driving from occurring in the first place? And I'm going to answer a little more broadly. There education programs. I think there should be more. There's publication on enforcement, but obviously one of the things that should be done throughout the country is let's try to reduce impaired driving, not just by stopping impaired drivers, but preventing them from doing the things that get them impaired in the first place. It's a great question. It's not one that we can answer in detail in a toxicology seminar, but I think it's a really good one. Let me just ask two other quick questions, and then we're going to have to end. One of them is, what's one aspect of impaired driving documentation you wish was done differently? And let me add to that, would you rather see blood, urine, oral fluids, or all three? Because that relates to the documentation. This is your dream world without funding problems or phlebotomy problems or whatever.
Blood. I'll say blood.
Blood. Okay.
Yes, it's like I said, I mentioned DC being urine. It can be increasingly difficult when we don't have that to answer the questions that the prosecutors and our defense want and probably do need answered, and for the judges to hear, because it doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't tell us the specific things we need to answer those, what was going on at the time of driving, so on and so forth. So my vote would be blood, always blood, if you can.
All right, one for blood. Amy.
Yeah, I absolutely 100% agree with that. And blood as close to the time of the event as possible. I mean, in Wisconsin, we're pretty rural and it can take 2 to 2.5 hours for that blood to be drawn. So we're fortunate we have a phlebotomy program. So for a lot of areas, they've reduced that down to 20 minutes. And then also, you're saying there's no barriers. I'd love to get brain. If we could get, it would not only give us a understanding of what's happening in the brain at the time, but then I think it would really reduce recidivism. I think people would probably, if they knew we took brain samples, they would probably not drive impaired.
Okay. All right, and let's turn to Dr. Jones.
Yeah, so blood, of course, oral fluid has power too, especially if we were just going to compare urine and oral fluid. At least with oral fluid, that's going to reflect more recent use than urine. So that'd be my second choice. But yeah, blood's going to be our best sample for showing recent use.
Okay, well, thank you. I've got one other quick question, and it may not be able to be answered quickly, but let's just have whatever quick answers. This may be redundant with some of the others, but it might open up some other areas. What are some of the tensions between national and regional or local toxicology practices? Okay, Sabra, you're smiling at that one.
That is such a great question. And I live this. I get this wonderful opportunity to support North Carolina and bring all their toxicologists together quarterly. And I facilitate their meetings. And it is so interesting because funding streams are not equal among all the labs touching impaired driving. And you can see those pain points, right? Because most of the money goes to the lab that's doing most of the work, but you still have jurisdictions that need to do testing, but the money is not always equal. And so I think we're seeing that. And I would love to hear Amy's perspective on where she sees some tensions regionally, nationally.
I agree. One of the states I represent is Ohio, and they have like 15 different labs, and they aren't all speaking to each other, and there are absolutely different funding streams for each. And so it is the same across most of those states that we have multiple labs in them.
Okay, well, thank you both. Dr. Raso, you have less of a nationwide perspective, but I'm sure you are still aware of some of these tensions.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of the same things. We keep coming back to it, comes back to the funding. So the laboratory's ability, whether it's in the middle of New York City or in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, like it's going to come down to what infrastructure and support do they have, is going to directly decide on what kind of testing they can provide and in the timeliness they can do it. It's just the unfortunate truth. And so until I guess every place in the world is exactly the same, which is unrealistic, there's going to be differences in what everybody can do. And it's just the unfortunate truth of it. But I think that's definitely where the differences are going to come in from a lab to lab perspective, even though we are theoretically doing the same thing and testing the same way.
Well, thank you. We're going to have to bring this to a close. I'm going to have a couple of more quick comments, but first let's have just a big round of applause for our three great toxicology presenters. You can't hear them, but I can tell people are applauding, and I wanted to, it just disappeared, but a commenter, Mary Knisley, I think is how you pronounce it, said what I'd like to say to end this. She said, "This is a simply amazing presentation. The information was presented in a concise and neutral manner." I'm going from memory because the answers disappeared. and the historical perspective added a great deal to the presentation. I think it's been just a fantastic. I want to thank all of you. And I want to again thank the Council for Court Excellence for their assistance, and ask Katie if you have any closing remarks, because I've just been so impressed with the knowledge that all three of you have, and with the clarity that with which you conveyed such complex information. Katie?
Yes, thank you to all of our panelists and to you, Judge Isco, for arranging this presentation. We were recording, and we will send the recording around to all of the registrants and also post it online, so this can be made available for all of you to share with your networks. Again, thank you to everyone for attending and for taking the time today to learn more about toxicology and impaired driving.
Thank you to all of you, and I'll distribute this to all the state judicial liaisons and all the regional ones, and particularly Robbie Hassel of our region, but to make sure everybody's aware of it. Thank you all. Everybody can log off now. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.